Hashtag the crash. Sarah Martinez had been flying medical supply missions over war-torn Bosnia for 8 months when everything went wrong. The 28-year-old pilot from Phoenix, Arizona, never imagined that her routine humanitarian flight would become a desperate fight for survival. It was a cold February morning in 1995 when Sarah received her assignment. The Red Cross needed emergency medical supplies delivered to a remote village near the Serbian border. The area was considered relatively safe, though tensions remained high after years of brutal conflict in the Balkans. Sarah performed her usual pre-flight checks on the small cargo plane. The weather looked challenging, but manageable. Light snow was falling, and visibility was decent enough for the short 90-minute flight. She had made this route dozens of times before, always landing safely at the makeshift airstrip carved out of farmer's field. The first hour of flight went smoothly. Sarah monitored her instruments while scanning the mountainous terrain below. The landscape looked peaceful from 8,000 feet, with snow-covered forests stretching endlessly in every direction. It was hard to imagine that a vicious war had torn this beautiful country apart. Then, the engine began to sputter. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the plane lurched forward. She quickly checked her fuel gauge and oil pressure readings. Everything looked normal, but the engine was clearly struggling. The sputtering grew worse, and she could feel the aircraft losing power. She grabbed her radio and called for help, but static filled the airwaves. The mountainous terrain was blocking her transmissions. Sarah was completely alone, 40 miles from her destination, flying over territory that changed hands between different military forces almost daily. The engine gave one final violent shake before dying completely. Sarah switched to emergency procedures she had practiced hundreds of times, but never hoped to use. She needed to find a place to land immediately. The plane was gliding now, losing altitude rapidly. Below her, the forest looked dense and unforgiving. Then she spotted it, a small clearing between the trees, maybe 200 yards long. It wasn't much, but it was her only chance. Sarah aimed for the opening and prepared for impact. The plane hit the frozen ground hard. Sarah felt her body slam against the restraints as the aircraft bounced and skidded across the rough terrain. Tree branches scraped against the wings, and she could hear metal twisting and tearing. The world spun violently around her before everything went black. When Sarah regained consciousness, snow was falling through a hole in the cockpit roof. Her head throbbed, and she could taste blood in her mouth. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, definitely broken. Pain shot through her ribs every time she breathed. She checked her watch. She had been unconscious for almost 2 hours. Sarah slowly unbuckled her harness and tried to assess her situation. The plane was destroyed, its nose buried in a large pine tree. The cargo area was completely crushed, and medical supplies were scattered everywhere. Miraculously, the fuel tank hadn't exploded. More importantly, she was alive. Sarah managed to crawl out of the wreckage through the damaged cockpit. The cold hit her immediately. The temperature was dropping fast as evening approached, and she was wearing only a light flight jacket. Her survival training kicked in as she realized the gravity of her situation. She was injured, alone, and stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies. No one knew exactly where she had crashed, and her radio was destroyed. The nearest friendly forces were at least 50 miles away through dangerous mountain terrain. Sarah found her emergency kit in the wreckage and took inventory of her supplies. She had a small first aid kit, some energy bars, a knife, matches, a compass, and a sleeping bag. There was also a pistol with 2 clips of ammunition, standard equipment for pilots operating in conflict zones. As darkness fell, Sarah made her first crucial decision. Moving at night in unfamiliar territory would be suicide. She needed to create shelter and wait until morning to begin her journey home. Using debris from the plane and pine branches, she built a small lean-to against a large rock formation about 50 yards from the crash site. She didn't want to sleep too close to the wreckage in case someone came looking for it. Sarah managed to start a small fire using dry wood from dead branches. The warmth felt incredible against her battered body. She used the first aid supplies to create a makeshift sling for her broken arm and bandaged a deep cut on her forehead. The pain was constant, but she forced herself to eat one of the energy bars. She needed to maintain her strength for the ordeal ahead. As she sat by the fire, Sarah tried to plan her route home. According to her compass, the nearest Allied checkpoint was roughly northeast of her position. But the terrain between here and there was mountainous and heavily forested. Worse yet, she knew that Serbian forces controlled much of this area, and they weren't known for treating captured enemy pilots kindly. Sarah had heard stories of other pilots who had been shot down during the conflict. Some were rescued quickly by special forces teams. Others were captured and spent months as prisoners of war. A few simply disappeared and were never found. She refused to accept any of those fates. Throughout the night, Sarah heard sounds in the forest that made her blood run cold. Sometimes it was just animals moving through the underbrush, but other times she was certain she heard vehicles in the distance. She kept the fire small and stayed alert, ready to extinguish it and hide if necessary. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped even further. Sarah's breath came out in white clouds, and ice had formed on the water she had collected in a small container. Her injuries had stiffened overnight, making every movement painful. She ate another energy bar and forced herself to drink some of the ice-cold water. Then, she carefully extinguished the fire and packed her limited supplies. It was time to begin the long journey home. Before leaving, Sarah took one last look at the crash site. The destroyed plane represented her old life. The routine flights, the comfortable barracks, the safety of Allied territory. She was leaving all of that behind and stepping into the unknown. Sarah checked her compass and began walking northeast through the dense forest. Each step sent waves of pain through her broken ribs, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace. She estimated that she could cover maybe 10 miles per day in this terrain, assuming she didn't run into enemy patrols or get lost. The first few hours of walking were the hardest. Sarah's body screamed in protest with every movement, and her broken arm throbbed constantly despite the makeshift sling. But gradually, she fell into a rhythm that allowed her to manage the pain. The forest was eerily quiet except for the sound of her boots crunching in the snow. Occasionally, she would hear birds calling to each other or the distant sound of falling water from a frozen stream. But mostly there was just silence and the endless rows of snow-covered trees. Around midday, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in terror, the sound of men's voices speaking Serbian. She immediately dropped behind a fallen log and listened carefully. The voices were getting closer. Through the trees, she could see movement. At least 3 men in military uniforms were walking directly toward her position, carrying automatic weapons. Sarah held her breath and pressed herself against the frozen ground. The soldiers passed within 20 feet of her hiding spot, talking casually among themselves. She couldn't understand their words, but their relaxed demeanor suggested they were on a routine patrol rather than actively searching for her. After they disappeared into the forest, Sarah waited another 30 minutes before moving. Her heart was still pounding from a close call. She realized that enemy forces were actively patrolling this area, which meant she would need to be extremely careful about her route and timing. For the rest of the day, Sarah moved cautiously through the forest, stopping frequently to listen for any signs of danger. She avoided open areas and ridge lines where she might be spotted from a distance. Instead, she stuck to thick stands of trees and natural depressions in the terrain. As evening approached, Sarah began looking for a place to spend the night. She found a small cave formed by large boulders that had tumbled down from a cliff face above. It wasn't much, but it would provide protection from the wind and hide any light from a fire. Sarah gathered dry wood and built another small fire deep inside the rocky shelter. The flames reflected off the stone walls, creating dancing shadows that reminded her of camping trips she had taken as a child with her father in the Arizona desert. Those memories seemed like they belonged to someone else's life now. As she ate another precious energy bar, Sarah calculated that she had covered maybe 6 miles during her first day of walking. At this rate, it would take her over a week to reach safety, assuming she didn't get lost or captured first. Her supplies would never last that long. She needed to find water and possibly food from the land itself. More importantly, she needed to avoid enemy patrols while making better time across the rugged terrain. That night, as wind howled outside her rocky shelter, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would make it home no matter what obstacles lay ahead. She had survived the crash and her first day in enemy territory. She could survive whatever came next. She just had to take it one step at a time. Sarah pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes, but sleep came only in brief, restless intervals. Every sound outside made her bolt upright. Reaching for the pistol, she kept close at hand. She was no longer just a pilot delivering medical supplies. She was now a soldier fighting for her life behind enemy lines. The real battle was just beginning. #The hunt. Sarah woke before dawn on her second day in the wilderness. The fire had died during the night, and the cave was bitterly cold. Ice crystals had formed on the inside walls, and her water bottle was frozen solid. She flexed her fingers to restore circulation, wincing as the movement sent sharp pains through her broken arm. Outside the rocky shelter, fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering her tracks from the previous day. This was both good and bad news. While it would help hide her trail from any pursuers, it also made walking more difficult and increased the risk of exposure. Sarah forced herself to eat another energy bar, though her supply was running dangerously low. She now had only 4 bars remaining, which meant she had maybe 2 more days of food if she rationed carefully. After that, she would have to find sustenance in the forest or risk starvation. She melted some snow in her metal water bottle using the dying embers of her fire, creating enough warm liquid to help ward off hypothermia. The hot water felt incredible going down her throat, and she could feel warmth spreading through her chest. Before leaving the cave, Sarah carefully studied her compass and tried to plot the best route forward. The terrain ahead looked even more challenging, with steep ridges and deep valleys that would force her to make difficult choices about which path to take. She decided to aim for higher ground where she could get a better view of the surrounding area and possibly spot signs of friendly forces. It was a risk because elevated positions would make her more visible to enemy patrols, but she needed to know where she was going. Sarah emerged from her shelter and began climbing up a steep, wooded slope. The fresh snow made footing treacherous, and she frequently slipped and fell despite trying to be careful. Each tumble sent waves of agony through her injured ribs and arm. After 2 hours of difficult climbing, she reached a ridgeline that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. What she saw made her stomach sink with dread. Smoke was rising from several locations in the forest, clear evidence of military activity. Through her small emergency binoculars, she could see vehicles moving along a dirt road about 3 miles to the east. More troubling, she spotted what appeared to be a checkpoint or small base camp near a bridge crossing a frozen river. The enemy presence was much heavier than she had expected. This wasn't just random patrols. There was a significant military operation happening in the area. Sarah realized she had crashed in the middle of what might be a major staging area for Serbian forces. As she watched through the binoculars, Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A helicopter was flying a search pattern over the forest where she had spent the previous night. They were looking for her crash site and probably for any survivors. Sarah immediately moved back from the ridgeline and found concealment among some thick pine trees. She needed to change her strategy completely. Moving during daylight was becoming too dangerous, and her original route would take her directly through areas of heavy enemy concentration. She spent the rest of the morning hidden in the trees, watching the helicopter make systematic passes over the forest. Around noon, she heard the distant sound of ground vehicles, and later she saw soldiers on foot moving through the valley below. They were definitely hunting for her. That afternoon, Sarah made a critical decision. Instead of continuing northeast toward the distant Allied checkpoint, she would head north toward higher mountains where enemy activity seemed lighter. It would be a longer, more dangerous route through harsher terrain, but it might be her only chance to avoid capture. As evening approached, Sarah began her second night of travel. Moving in darkness was treacherous, especially with her injuries, but she had no choice. She used her small flashlight sparingly, cupping her hand over the beam to create just enough light to see obstacles in her path. The night journey was a nightmare of stumbling through thick underbrush, climbing over fallen trees, and navigating around frozen streams. Sarah fell dozens of times, each impact jarring her broken bones and opening cuts on her exposed skin. Around midnight, she heard dogs barking in the distance. The sound sent terror through her body like an electric shock. Tracking dogs meant that ground teams were actively following her trail, and they were getting close. Sarah knew she had perhaps an hour before the dogs would pick up her scent and lead their handlers directly to her. She needed to find water to break her scent trail. Sarah changed direction and began moving downhill toward the sound of running water she had noticed earlier. Fighting through thick brambles that tore at her clothes and skin, she eventually reached a stream that was still flowing despite the freezing temperature. Without hesitation, she waded into the icy water. The cold was so intense it felt like knives cutting in her legs, but she forced herself to walk downstream for nearly half a mile. The current was strong enough to carry away her scent and hopefully confuse the tracking dogs. When she finally climbed out of the stream, Sarah's legs were completely numb and her boots were full of water. She knew she was risking severe frostbite, but staying ahead of her pursuers was more important than preserving her toes. Sarah found a dense thicket of thorny bushes and crawled deep into the center, ignoring the branches that scratched her face and hands. She pulled her sleeping bag around her soaking wet clothes and tried to generate some body heat through shivering. The dogs had stopped barking, which meant either they had lost her trail or their handlers had called them back. Sarah hoped it was the former, but she couldn't take any chances. She would stay hidden until dawn before moving again. That was the longest, coldest night of her life. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fighting hypothermia while her mind battled waves of despair. Her food was almost gone. Her feet might be frostbitten, and enemy forces were actively hunting her with dogs and helicopters. For the first time since the crash, she seriously wondered if she would make it home alive. When morning came, Sarah could barely feel her feet inside her boots. She knew she was in serious trouble medically, but stopping to treat her injuries would mean certain capture. She had to keep moving regardless of the consequences. Her third day of walking was pure agony. Every step felt like walking on broken glass, and she had to stop frequently to rest and catch her breath. The combination of injuries, exhaustion, and poor nutrition was taking a severe toll on her body. Around midday, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in a grove of pine trees, she found the remnants of an old shepherd's hut. The roof had partially collapsed, but the stone walls were still intact and would provide excellent concealment. More importantly, she found supplies. Previous occupants had left behind some canned food, a wool blanket, and, most valuable of all, a detailed topographic map of the local area. The map showed hiking trails, mountain passes, and settlements that weren't marked on her basic military chart. Sarah studied the map carefully and realized she had been heading in the wrong direction. There was actually a shorter route to safety that avoided the main valleys where enemy forces were concentrated. The path led through a high mountain pass that would be extremely difficult to navigate in winter conditions, but it would cut days off her journey. She ate one of the canned meals, her first real food since the crash, and felt strength returning to her body. The wool blanket would provide additional warmth, and having an accurate map would help her navigate more efficiently. That evening, Sarah left the shepherd's hut and began climbing toward the mountain pass marked on her new map. The route was steeper and more treacherous than anything she had attempted so far, but it represented her best hope for reaching friendly territory before her body gave out completely. As she climbed through the night, Sarah could see lights in the valley below that marked enemy positions. She was literally looking down on her pursuers while they searched for her in the wrong places. For the first time since the crash, she felt like she might actually have a chance to escape. The mountain trail wound back and forth across steep slopes covered with loose rock and patches of ice. Sarah used her hands as much as her feet, pulling herself up difficult sections while her broken arm screamed in protest. Several times, she nearly fell off narrow ledges that dropped hundreds of feet into dark ravines. But she kept climbing. By dawn of her fourth day, Sarah had gained significant elevation and could see a high mountain pass in the distance. According to her map, the pass would lead down into a valley controlled by Allied forces. She estimated she could reach the summit by evening if she maintained her current pace. However, the weather was deteriorating rapidly. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, and the wind was picking up significantly. Sarah recognized the signs of an approaching storm that could dump several feet of snow and create whiteout conditions. She had to reach the pass before the storm hit, or she would be trapped on the exposed mountainside with no shelter. Sarah pushed herself harder than she ever had before, climbing steadily through the morning despite growing fatigue and pain. Her broken arm had swollen badly and was turning purple, indicating possible complications that would require immediate medical attention. But medical attention would have to wait. Right now, her only focus was putting one foot in front of the other and reaching that mountain pass before the storm arrived. Around noon, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within an hour, the wind was howling and snow was falling so heavily that Sarah could barely see 10 feet in front of her. The temperature dropped dramatically, and exposed skin began to sting from the driving wind and ice crystals. Sarah was climbing blind now, following the trail more by feel than sight. She used her hands to feel for rock cairns that marked the route, and she counted her steps to estimate distance traveled. The storm was turning into a full blizzard, with winds strong enough to knock her off balance. Several times she lost the trail completely and had to backtrack until she found the stone markers again. Each mistake cost precious time and energy that she couldn't afford to lose. Her body was running on pure adrenaline and determination. As afternoon turned to evening, Sarah finally saw something through the swirling snow that made her heart leap. A wooden sign marking the summit of the pass. She had made it to the highest point of her journey, and according to the map, it was all downhill from here to friendly territory. But the storm was getting worse, and she had no shelter on the exposed summit. Sarah knew she had to get below the tree line quickly before the blizzard killed her. She began descending the far side of the mountain, following a trail that switched back down steep slopes toward a forested valley below. The wind was at her back now, pushing her forward faster than she wanted to go. Several times she lost her footing and slid uncontrollably down icy sections of trail. As darkness fell, Sarah finally reached the shelter of trees on the lower slopes. The forest provided some protection from the wind, though snow continued to fall heavily. She was exhausted beyond description and knew she couldn't go much further without rest. Sarah found a large pine tree with drooping branches that created a natural shelter underneath. She crawled into the space and pulled her sleeping bag and the wool blanket around her body. For the first time in days, she felt relatively safe and warm. According to her map, she was now only about 15 miles from the nearest Allied checkpoint. If the weather cleared, she could probably make it there in one more day of walking. Sarah allowed herself to hope that her ordeal might soon be over. But first, she had to survive the night in the middle of the mountain blizzard, alone and injured, with no food left and rapidly failing strength. The mountain pass had been her greatest challenge yet, but she suspected the hardest part of her journey still lay ahead. Hashtag the final push. Sarah woke to silence. The howling wind had stopped, and no more snow was falling from the branches above her makeshift shelter. Pale morning sunlight filtered through the pine needles, creating patterns of light and shadow on the white ground. Her 5th day in the wilderness had arrived, and she was still alive. But barely. Sarah tried to sit up, and immediately felt the world spinning around her. Her body was shutting down from exhaustion, dehydration, and lack of food. Her broken arm had turned an alarming shade of purple and had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Infection was setting in, and without medical treatment soon, she could lose the limb or worse. Her feet were completely numb inside her boots, a sign that frostbite had progressed to a dangerous stage. When she tried to wiggle her toes, she felt nothing at all. Walking was becoming increasingly difficult as her frozen feet could no longer provide reliable feedback about the terrain beneath them. Sarah knew she was in a race against time. Her body was failing rapidly, and she had perhaps one more day of strength left before complete collapse. According to her map, the Allied checkpoint was still 15 miles away through forest and hills that would test every remaining ounce of her willpower. She forced herself to drink some melted snow and try to eat some pine needles she had heard contained vitamin C. The needles tasted terrible and made her stomach cramp, but she needed any nutrition she could find. Sarah packed her remaining supplies and emerged from her tree shelter into a winter wonderland. The storm had dumped nearly 2 feet of fresh snow, transforming the landscape into a brilliant white maze. The snow was so deep that each step required enormous effort as she broke through the surface crust. Following the trail was now impossible since all landmarks were buried under snow. Sarah relied entirely on her compass, heading due east toward where the checkpoint should be located. She moved slowly and methodically, conserving energy while making steady progress through the deep drifts. The morning passed in a blur of exhausting steps through snow that sometimes reached her knees. Sarah fell frequently as her numb feet failed to detect obstacles hidden beneath the surface. Each fall became harder to recover from as her strength ebbed away. Around midday, Sarah heard something that made her freeze with terror, the distant sound of helicopter rotors. She immediately dove under the overhanging branches of a large evergreen tree and pressed herself against the trunk. Through gaps in the foliage, she could see a military helicopter flying a search pattern over the forest. It was moving slowly and systematically, as if the crew was examining every detail of the terrain below. The helicopter passed directly over her hiding spot, so close that she could feel the downdraft from its rotors shaking the tree branches above her head. Sarah held her breath and remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement might give away her position. After what felt like an eternity, the helicopter moved on to search other areas of the forest. Sarah waited another 30 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, but the encounter had shaken her badly. Enemy forces were still actively hunting for her, even after 5 days. They were not going to give up easily. That afternoon, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. She began experiencing dizzy spells that forced her to stop and lean against trees until her vision cleared. Her broken arm was now causing constant, severe pain that made it difficult to concentrate on navigation. More troubling, she was beginning to hallucinate. Several times, Sarah thought she saw people moving through the trees ahead of her, only to discover they were just shadows created by swaying branches. She heard voices calling her name, but when she stopped to listen carefully, there was only the sound of wind through pine needles. These were signs of advanced hypothermia and exhaustion. Her brain was starting to malfunction due to the extreme stress her body was under. Sarah knew that people in her condition sometimes made fatal mistakes, walking in circles, removing their clothes in freezing temperatures, or simply lying down in the snow and never getting up. She had to maintain focus on her goal and ignore the tricks her mind was playing on her. As evening approached, Sarah reached the edge of the forest and found herself looking out over a snow-covered valley. According to her map, the Allied checkpoint should be located somewhere on the far side of this valley, probably another 8 miles away. But crossing the open valley would make her visible to anyone watching from the surrounding hills. Sarah could see several plumes of smoke rising from different locations, indicating human activity that could be either friendly or hostile forces. She made the difficult decision to wait until darkness before attempting to cross the exposed terrain. Spending another night in the cold might kill her, but walking across that valley in daylight would definitely result in capture or death. Sarah found a small depression in the ground near the tree line and used pine branches to create a windbreak. She had no energy left to build a fire, so she simply wrapped herself in her sleeping bag and wool blanket and tried to generate warmth through shivering. That night was the worst yet. Sarah's body temperature dropped so low that she stopped shivering, a dangerous sign that her system was beginning to shut down. She drifted in and out of consciousness, experiencing vivid dreams about home, family, and her life before the war. Several times she woke up convinced that rescuers had found her, only to realize she was still alone in the frozen wilderness. The boundary between reality and hallucination was becoming increasingly blurred. Somehow, Sarah survived until dawn. When morning came, she could barely stand. Her legs felt like rubber, and her vision was filled with black spots that came and went without warning. Moving her broken arm sent waves of nausea through her entire body. But she was still alive, and the valley ahead represented her final obstacle before reaching safety. Sarah began descending into the valley, moving like an old woman despite being only 28 years old. Each step required tremendous concentration and effort. She fell repeatedly, but forced herself to get back up each time, knowing that staying down meant death. Halfway across the valley, Sarah heard dogs barking again. The sound came from behind her, back in the forest she had just left. Through her binoculars, she could see men with rifles and tracking dogs moving along her trail. They had finally picked up her scent and were closing in for the capture. Sarah looked ahead toward the far side of the valley and estimated she had maybe 4 miles left to reach the checkpoint. Behind her, the pursuit team was probably less than an hour away. It would be close, but she might still make it if she could find the strength for one final push. She abandoned all caution and began moving as fast as her damaged body would allow. Sarah stumbled and fell through the snow, got up, and kept going. She fell again, got up again, and continued forward. Her body was running on pure willpower now, with no reserves of strength left to draw upon. The barking behind her grew louder and more excited. The dogs had definitely found her trail and were leading their handlers directly toward her. Sarah could hear men shouting to each other in Serbian, coordinating their pursuit. As she crested a small hill on the far side of the valley, Sarah saw something that made her heart leap with joy, a military checkpoint with American flags flying from the guard towers. She had found her destination, but Sarah also realized she would never make it there before her pursuers caught her. The checkpoint was still 2 miles away, and the enemy soldiers were now close enough that she could hear their individual voices through the trees behind her. Sarah made a desperate decision. She pulled out her pistol and fired 3 shots into the air, the international distress signal. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder, and she hoped someone at the checkpoint would hear it and respond. Then she kept running towards safety, even though running was no longer physically possible. Sarah was moving in a stumbling, lurching gait that covered ground slowly but steadily. Behind her, she could hear excited shouts as her pursuers realized their quarry was close. Suddenly, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air again. But this time, the aircraft that appeared over the ridgeline was an American Black Hawk helicopter with U.S. Army markings on its side. Someone at the checkpoint had heard her distress signal and sent help. The helicopter landed in a clearing about 200 yards ahead of Sarah's position. Armed soldiers jumped out and began running toward her, while the aircraft's door gunner kept watch for any threats from the surrounding forest. Sarah tried to wave to signal her location, but her arm wouldn't respond properly. Instead, she simply kept walking forward, one step at a time, toward the soldiers who were coming to save her. Behind her, the enemy pursuit team had stopped at the edge of the tree line. They could see the American helicopter and soldiers, and they knew their chance to capture her had passed. After a few minutes, Sarah heard them retreating back into the forest. The first American soldier reached her just as her legs finally gave out completely. Sarah collapsed into his arms, unable to speak or even cry. She had made it. After 6 days behind enemy lines, fighting through injuries, starvation, hypothermia, and constant pursuit, she was finally safe. The soldier carried her to the helicopter, where a medic immediately began treating her injuries. As the aircraft lifted off and flew toward a field hospital, Sarah looked down at the valley where she had spent her final night as a hunted fugitive. The ordeal was over, but the landscape below still looked beautiful despite everything it had put her through. Sarah realized that she had discovered something about herself during those 6 days that she never knew existed, a strength and determination that could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. 3 weeks later, after multiple surgeries to repair her broken arm and treat her severe frostbite, Sarah was transported to a hospital in Germany for additional recovery. Doctors told her she was lucky to be alive, and even luckier to keep all her fingers and toes despite the extensive cold injuries. During her hospital stay, Sarah learned that a special forces team had been searching for her since the day after her crash. They had found the wreckage of her plane, but assumed she had died in the impact since there was no sign of survivors. Her decision to move away from the crash site had actually made it harder for rescuers to find her. The Serbian forces that had been hunting her were part of a larger military operation that was eventually driven out of the area by NATO airstrikes. If she had been captured, Sarah probably would have become a prisoner of war or worse. 6 months later, Sarah was back in the United States, undergoing physical therapy to regain full use of her arm and leg muscles that had been damaged by frostbite. The ordeal had left her with permanent scars and some lingering nerve damage, but she was alive and whole. More importantly, she had proven to herself that she could survive anything life threw at her. Sarah never flew combat missions again, but she did return to flying civilian aircraft after her recovery. She often thought about those 6 days in the wilderness and how they had changed her perspective on what really mattered in life. She had been left for dead behind enemy lines, but she had refused to give up. Through determination, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower, she had battled her way home step by step across 50 miles of hostile territory. Sarah Martinez had discovered that the human spirit could overcome incredible obstacles when survival was at stake. That knowledge would stay with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that she was stronger than she had ever imagined possible. The girl from Phoenix who had once delivered medical supplies in a war zone had become a survivor whose story would inspire others facing their own impossible battles. She had walked through hell and emerged on the other side, forever changed but unbroken. Her journey home had ended, but her story of courage and survival would live on.